Is IMF the kiss of death to Africans and developing countries all around the world? IMF is known to be the last resort when it comes to lending to countries who they operate on fiscal deficit on their budgets. Now, IMF has also been known in terms of crushing countries' economy, especially in Africa, because IMF is the sister to the World Bank, and all those two organizations, they all work under the United Nations categories. Now, what I love about IMF is one thing. They are known to hold countries accountable. They are known to give critics to a country. At the same time, they are known to give loans in the billions and billions and billions. For example, recently, last year, I believe, Ghana was given around $3 billion for bailout. In terms of Ghana, they were undergoing through an economic crisis, economic recession, and they went to IMF. The IMF gave them $3 billion for economic stability, for economic growth. Nigeria, they were given around close to 30 billion US dollars for economic stability. They say this is for economic stability, and then they are more in debt. The Nigerian naira was crushing at a very, very, very alarming rate. At the same time, recently we came to Kenya, whereby they give conditions. They give harsh economic conditions, especially to the ruling government. It's called Kenya Kwanza. Kenya Kwanza United Democratic Alliance, or Ushuru Democratic Alliance, so to speak, because the only thing they know is to rise taxes, increase taxes. That's what they're known for in Kenya, which caused a massive nationwide protest, right? Protest from, we saw people from Kenyans who live in Kenya in the US. They went to the Kenyan embassy in the US and demonstrate. We saw Kenyans in the UK. They went to Kenyan embassy and demonstrate. We saw Kenyans in the Netherlands, in The Hague. They went to The Hague and they demanded the reopening of President William Samoei Ruto, His Excellency, so to speak, okay? All demanded for them to be open a new case, which was back in the 2007 about killings during the election time, 2020 Kenyans, they faced post-election violence, okay? Now, this nationwide protest, it was because of something called the Finance Bill 2024 to 2025, which was drafted, so to speak, by the IM and the F. It stands for International Monetary Fund. They give short-term loans. This is the only difference between IMF and the World Bank. World Bank are known to give 10 years grace period loan, 20, 30-year grace period loan. But for the IMF, short-term loans. Check it. The president saying, His Excellency William Samoei Ruto, he said that he will never borrow. He will never borrow. Where we saw that he borrowed around 1.2 billion USD. And you will never see this in the budget. But this loan was used, half of that loan was used to pay other debt like the Euro bond, which is very unconstitutional, to borrow and to borrow money and pay another borrowed money. Number two, whereby we saw that he came up with this finance bill so that he can increase something called the SDR, the special drawing rate with the IMF, so that he can borrow more and more and more money. And the IMF are known still, if listen, if an African leader in all entire African continent, if you oppose the IMF, if you say no to the IMF and it's Friday, you rest assured on Monday, probably you won't see Monday. Why? Because you've seen countries, African leaders being assassinated. We see countries like Djibouti where they have been given sanctions and more sanctions. Uganda, sanctions and more sanctions. Why? Because the president is rejecting the IMF. We saw Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has six or close to 7 assassination attempts and all have failed. Why? Because he said, number 1, no to the IMF. Number 2, he kicked out he said no to the French language. And number 3, he said no to the French currency, the CFA franc, or the colonism of French currency, which is backed by the euros. He said no to them. And now 6 or more than 7 assassination attempts all failed. We saw whereby the IMF Ukraine is in $200 billion loan for the IMF, drowning in debt the Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine supposedly they have 12 trillion in USD lithium, and the West wants it, especially where I will mention the country. You know the country. It's called the US and the A. We saw Argentina. They went to a harsh economic crisis, and poverty is more and more in Argentina. They're like, how many? It was around, at that time, they were the highest in debt with the IMF. And the president was overthrown. Okay, where we saw another country like Greece, where we saw the Gen Zs of the youth, they were forced to move out of Greece because the economic crisis, deep economic crisis that forced the youth of Greece to move out of Greece. And now Greece has a majority of the population. They are elderly people. Yes, they do have some youth, but not much use as compared to 1990s in Greece, where we saw the imperialism at high levels. And we saw countries like China, they know to forgive debt. So in countries like Africa, around the world, we only left with several conditions. Number 1, is that you're forgiving debt, which IMF, I don't think so they will forgive any African country their debt. Number 2, is that you default on their debt. Or number 3, he said that you be debt trapped more and more with these loans, right? They are good, but here's the thing: you cannot blame a situation whereby you have budgeted corruption, where the economy, they say, listen, in the next year fiscal budget, we seek to raise around 4 trillion or 5 trillion, so to speak, and then 1 trillion maybe shillings, it may be 1 trillion naira, it may be 1 trillion dinar, it may be 1 trillion in your country currency that is budgeted purely for corruption. You cannot blame this to the IMF, but you can only blame this to the leader who's in power. It's the thing with overtaxation is that you cannot solve debt trap. You cannot choose to overtax your Kenyan citizens in the form of I will pay debt, and at the same time you taking back another debt. And the country currency, the USD and the Kenyan shillings, is fluctuating, whereby we saw a scenario whereby the dollar reached the high. $1 is equals to 160 Kenyan shillings. And you say, of course, the interest rates now when you want to pay debt, if you was paying debt in 50 million, let's say for example 50 million every single month, now you have to pay 65 or maybe 70 because of country or foreign exchange transaction. And another thing, you're taking more and more debt, you forcing it on the younger generation. The younger generation they live in a digital world where they see guys in South Africa, guys in New York, guys in UK, guys in London, guys in where, especially the young people, living a lifestyle that they deserve, that they desire to live, that they say, one day I will live this type of lifestyle. And they're looking at the future with overtaxation, and they see they're doomed. Of course, they will revolt on the current regime, which is exactly what has happened. And check it, the president said that he will borrow 1 trillion shillings. Number one, how do you come up with the factors, Your Excellency, as to say, hey, I will borrow 1 trillion shillings? How do you come up with such a relationship over the years? Okay, and we know for a fact that some of these African countries, they took debt, which majority end up in very complex hedge fund scheme. Very complex hedge fund scheme. Why? Because it's reportedly that majority of the African leaders, they also have foreign bank accounts. They have overseas offshore banking accounts, and they can take that. And the IMF knows this, that they take that and they loot. They take that and they loot. They take that and they loot. And they can use that as your advantage. And the more you drown in debt, some of these African leaders, they steal, they loot, and they take money to where? To them offshore banking accounts. At a richer time, whereby we will see all the corrupt money Africa was stolen from, it will be returned to Africans, children, African generations. Okay, we saw this protest in Kenya doing a massive, entirely African youths have started to rise. You go to Nigeria, they start to protesting. They start to raise up their voice against the corrupt leaders. You go to a country like Uganda, the same thing is happening. You go to a country like Tanzania, the same thing is happening. You go to a country like Ghana, they start rising and they start demanding the African leaders, African presidents say, hey, listen, if you try to pass punitive bills, punitive taxation in your country, you will end up like Kenya, where the youths are starting to do what is called an economic and political revolution, which to my thinking and to my feeling, it will never stop. It will never probably stop. The only thing will stop is if we have good governance, good accountability system, proper leadership who are ruled by economic greed and not greed of the situations in the people's life, whereby we demand people to be selfless leaders, people to put the interests of the people who elected them, people to put the interests of the people who voted for them to be in those places, to be in those leadership positions, to say, hey, listen, I will hear your voice. I will hear what you want. I will address what you want. I will address what you desire. I will provide 5,000 jobs if that means to lower taxation so that we can build capital and more companies can choose to set up base in Kenya or in Uganda or in Tanzania to employ a yearly, let's say per yearly, we provide jobs of how many? Let's say per yearly, we attract capital, we attract foreign direct investment, we employ 500,000 Kenyans, 500,000 Ugandans, 500,000 Tanzania, 1.5 million people, jobs to be created for them every single year. Every single year. There won't be no need of taking debt which is unconstitutional, taking debt, doing budgeting corruption. At the same time, the economic growth and the poverty rate will go down, the unemployment rate will go down, and the GDP slowly will start to rise. At the same time, inflation and recession, they all rebound to 1.2%, or maybe the highest probably 3%, right? So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, see you on the next video.